this session is under the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity in Asia. As you know, the UN Plan of Action was adopted in 2012, and it has provided during the last 5 years a framework, I would say a roadmap, to reinforce media safety and combating impunity. It is a multi-stakeholder initiative. My colleague Franck Larue is going to speak about it. We have done quite a lot of advances since 5 years, but the challenge remains quite huge. In Asia, because we are going to speak of this region, one figure, 25% of the killing of journalists represent the total of the killing of journalists around the world. So we need to be more strategic and more to have more deep thinking on how to move forward together and to be more relevant to the regional and the national needs. I'm going to give the floor right now to my colleagues. I'm going to ask them to be concise and to have intervention of a maximum of 5 minutes, so it will allow us to have a discussion with the floor. Franck Larue, you are the Assistant Director General of UNESCO, former rapporteur of UN on the protection and of freedom of expression and freedom of opinion. Would you be able to give a broad vision of what is the UN Plan of Action, what has been done over the last 5 years, and the way to look forward for the future, obviously with an emphasis on Asia?
Okay, thank you very much, Sylvie, and thank you all for being here today, and for the panelists as well. I will be brief to listen to the important people and interesting people here on the panel. Before we begin, just let me say there will be a publication very soon, a book, a compilation by Ulla Carlson called Assault on Journalism, which is basically a look at what has been the attacks on journalism safety, on journalism in recent years and recent times, and the reaction by the UN Plan of Action and other responses. I think it's important to analyze this reality. And again, this following on that, this was the motivation. The UN Plan of Action came out of the necessity we all felt of joining forces to look at this particular issue. Journalism is being attacked, and I think more aggressively in recent years. Our experience is that in the last decade we have had at least 823 assassinations of journalists. This is the numbers that we have dealt with in the report of the Director General, but we are sure that the real numbers are much higher, and that possibly that the numbers will be at least 50% more of cases that are not necessarily denounced as harassment or attack on journalists. There have been 8 resolutions in the UN system, 2 of them in the Security Council, several in the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, and in Paris, and still the trend of violence continues. And today we add new elements that we have mentioned in other panels in this conference. A very preoccupying phenomenon is the harassment online of journalists, but especially the sexual harassment of women journalists, which has, we believe, increased according to the cases we have received information on. So clearly, the idea of safety of journalists and protection of journalists is a crucial element for all of us. And this is what 5 years ago motivated that UNESCO with other agencies, and at the initiative of UNESCO, there was the idea of creating a commitment of all the UN system, especially with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where there is obviously a particular coordination on these issues for freedom of expression and freedom of the press and safety of journalists, but also with the idea was that all agencies, in whatever their mandate, could also be part of this and participate. So 5 years ago, this was created. as an interagency plan of action. And of course, as the UN has the principle of participation of civil society and coordination, it was designed as a multi-stakeholder plan that should be designed with NGOs, especially human rights NGOs, but NGOs in general, as those that work on freedom of expression and privacy, ICTs, communication, and other issues related to the topic, as well as more specifically with press associations and organizations of journalists. The experience, I think, has been very interesting, but we're going to have an evaluation, as you all know, on June 29th in Geneva, which again will want to be a multi-stakeholder evaluation with the participation of state representatives there from the Geneva embassies, with participation of the UN bodies and civil society in different forms, whether it be journalist associations or NGOs. This is an important stage because the plan of action demonstrated that some agencies responded well. Like I said, the coordination between us, UNESCO, and the Office of the High Commissioner was increased, but not all agencies responded equally. And we believe this should be very important. There is a concern for safety of journalists in zones of conflict. Obviously, the Security Council mentioned this, and we have had meetings with OSHA, and clearly the idea of humanitarian assistance is there, but we believe there should be some role for the Security Council and then the Secretary General, especially the new Secretary General, on the prevention of these cases in zones of conflict. But of course, safety of journalists is a concern all around the world, whether countries are in conflict or not. And many countries that have the highest index of killings of journalists are not necessarily countries in conflict. So this is, again, a very preoccupying phenomenon, and we believe that it should never be understood that the profession of journalism is intrinsically dangerous and per se, and therefore one should accept this. We, from UNESCO, believe that the safety of journalists has 4 basic points. We should be looking at the legal framework first, and whether the legal framework recognizes freedom of expression, access to information, transparency, privacy, protection of sources, and safety in general. Secondly, whether there are policies of prevention, the 3 Ps that we call the prevention policies that include capacity building training. We're now training, for instance, not only journalists and security forces. We have begun in Latin America. UNESCO signed an agreement with the Ibero-American Summit of Supreme Courts, which means that the Supreme Courts of Latin America, the Caribbean, plus Spain and Portugal. And this was very important because we developed a online course. We had already done that in Brazil and in Mexico. We did the first course, but now it's going to be for all Latin America in Spanish, online with support of the University of Texas. And we already have, I was just speaking to Rosenthal this morning, who's in another event here. We have 2,200 people registered, most of them judges and lawyers, which is a big success. And they will be able to follow up for a series of weeks. We have the presentations, the monitors, and the tutors online to follow up with them. We're now planning a second stage of this, is to move into Africa and to have the same MOOC course, but this time in 2 languages, in English and French, for depending on the Francophone or Anglophone part of Africa. And we're in conversations with the Arab region to begin thinking of doing one in Arabic. Our biggest desire is that in the Southeast Asia, because this is related here, we wanted to have a mechanism of safety designed by the ASEAN countries or by the ASEAN Human Rights Commission. We had suggested since many years the possibility of having a rapporteur for freedom of expression and freedom of the press, safety of journalists, but at the same time, parallel to that, to have a mechanism of safety, either individually in each one of the 10 countries of the ASEAN region or collectively as region. But we're still just proposing this idea. Part of it was to bring it here and to have this be part of the dialogue that we could enhance. In any case, I think we have moved one new element as well. I was mentioning we recently had a meeting of regulatory bodies of audiovisual services. There was a South-South meeting of solidarity in the city of Fez in Morocco that brought together African regulatory bodies with Latin American regulatory bodies. So now they are proposing, and they're following up through PRAI, the Latin American Association of Regulatory Bodies, based in Chile, to follow up in a MOOC course as well for regulatory bodies. So we believe that this is opening the door for different activities that we could all engage in. It is clear, and we are very conscious that it's also a moment of danger, the moment of very severe danger. I think I have to say this because just in this conference, I've heard about several countries that are about to pass legislation that because of arguments on national security or on other issues, related issues, are about to begin laws that jeopardize seriously either the privacy of communications and of journalists or the role of journalists as a whole, or the freedom of association, which implies also journalists, and the kind of obligation that states want to impose on journalism to be objective and say the truth under the light of what the state defines, or to be ethical. We believe in ethics and we believe in professionalism, but we believe this is something that the journalists themselves, men and women, developed as a capacity building element and as a voluntary decision to be ethical.
Thank you, Frank.
This is the possibility for us. Thank you.
Thank you. You were mentioning the 3 Ps, which is the prevention, the procuration, and the protection of journalists. Maybe Catherine Raimondo, you are working for the Southeast Alliance of Press Alliance, which is the Southeast organization working for the defense of freedom of expression. Could you explain a little bit the best practice in the region concerning the implementation of the UN plan, especially around these 3 protection, prevention, and procuration?
Good afternoon. So the Southeast Asian Press Alliance is an organization of 12 members that have 12 members in 7 countries in the region. These members have been involved in a number of interventions on how to assure safety for journalists and also media organizations. One, we are proposing to develop a more systematic plan of scanning, a systematic scan of comparison of the laws that we have in Southeast Asia, as well as documenting the state responses to the different issues. Second is the completion of a database on the cases of violations. Third is to make use of the different existing mechanisms that we have, which are the national human rights institutions, the reports on the UPR, as well as making engagement with IHR more possible. So these are not just country reports. We wanted to do a more coordinated effort to have the different reports going to these institutions. Also, we want to strengthen and provide a better legal defense program for the region, because as we all know, one issue of the attacks in the region is about has to do with laws and regulations. And in terms of within what the media organizations can do, we're continuing with the safety training programs, different training programs to build the capacity of the journalists and media organizations. So this can be on ethics, safety trainings, as well as legal competency. And our last effort is to have the different press councils and use the different press councils to intervene if there are any issues that we don't have to go through the government immediately, but go through the press councils if it has to do with media organizations and journalists. So if it will work, we have the Myanmar Press Council, East Timor Press Council, Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia. So.
Sorry. Thank you. You were speaking of the Press Council of national mechanism or state mechanism. I think, Elizabeth Witschel, you are a consultant for IMS, but you have also worked extensively on the issue of impunity with CPJ. IMS just made a research on the national mechanism in Southeast Asia. Could you sum up a little bit the result of this research and what concrete actions could be taken for the future?
Sorry. So the research was conducted in 7 countries: Afghanistan, Indonesia, Nepal, Pakistan, Philippines, Iraq, and Colombia, by local researchers and writers. And we're pulling it all together to identify good practices and also to look at how the UN Plan of Action factors into the development of these programs and the impact of the UN Plan of Action. So the research looks at several safety programs. So some of them are official mechanisms, some are formal and informal multi-stakeholder coalitions, and some are just robust programs by individual groups or partnerships between 1 or 2 or 3 organizations. So some of the practices that we identified coming out of this report are, some of the good practices are that presence is essential, and by presence, I mean in-country presence, but not just in the country, throughout the country. So programs that have localized or provincial offices in all areas of the country have the following advantages. The constituents have access to support, and then information is the other important factor. Through reach and access throughout the country, you can monitor and collect data and create better solutions and track and find out and produce credible information. And that can in turn be used in advocacy and in developing safety programs. It's also essential for implementation. Some of the examples that are cited in the report I'll use Afghanistan first. The Afghan Journalist Safety Committee has offices throughout the country that can collect data and respond to emergencies, but they also have dedicated female staff to work with female journalists under threat. Looking at using Afghanistan again, if you want to move that up to one of the coalitions, in Afghanistan, there was recently formed the Joint Committee for the Safety and Security of Journalists, which involves a government, media, and NGO partnership to promote better safety practices. And that has also established localized departments. Another example is in Pakistan, which there's a partnership between an existing press clubs network and a distress fund, an organization running a distress fund, can access data and also verify cases and in turn give effective support. The second factor is collaboration. So under that, I see innovative partnerships and the ability to take on joint advocacy. Coordination falls under that, as well as network building. And through coordination, we can eliminate redundancy. And the areas where this is particularly important are in when establishing a multi-stakeholder coalition, there has to be a very clear point of coordination, and also international and national coordination is an area where there's been, I would say there's been some failings that coming out of this report. The third factor is influence. So by influence, a mechanism or a program needs to, the ones that were effective are have some really mobilize powerful actors. So in this context, being able to mobilize or have access or engagement with the government to actually implement some of the protection and investigative programs is key, but also mobilizing the media on a greater level. So a good example of that is in Pakistan, where there's been they've developed an Editors for Safety network, which has coordinated editors around coordinating press coverage when a journalist is attacked, and that in turn has led to the increased pressure and attention has pushed authorities to respond to those attacks better. The third piece of the influence is international groups, the international community. So the attention and the participation of international bodies and international NGOs helps raise the advocacy pressure around safety issues, and of course also brings much needed support. The fourth area is sustainability, and that means committed participants. So if you're looking at a multi-stakeholder mechanism, you need committed stakeholders, but you also need someone to act as the driver, someone who's really in it for the long term, kind of managing the pieces, keeping everything focused. And the other problem is in some of the mechanisms that are looked at in this report, the government is an engaged stakeholder in the beginning, but slowly they participate less and less. So in any model that includes government and civil society support, there needs to be a level of commitment on the government. And that includes as well not just participants from, say, high level. A minister may not be the best person to participate in a safety mechanism because what you really need is someone from maybe that office or the appropriate office who's actually going to be involved in implementation. The other thing that falls under sustainability are sources of support. Many safety initiatives around the region and also on the others identified in this report are very reliant on a pretty small cast of funding characters, and and so we need to diversify sources of support. We need to, I think donors need to understand that there's a long-term picture here. That the goals are long-term, and not to let some of these promising initiatives begin and get cut short through funding difficulties.
Elizabeth, we may come back to
Yeah.
some of your findings after.
Okay.
You were speaking of mechanisms, and here we have examples of two national mechanisms, one in Nepal and one in Sri Lanka. Laxman, you are the chairperson of the Media Action Nepal. Maybe you could provide some input about the implementation of the UN plan in Nepal and this mechanism and the future of this mechanism.
Thank you. I would like to be specific. Since the implementation of UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and issue of impunity in Nepal, there are some tangible changes that the UN Plan of Action has carried out in Nepal, especially that of creating wider awareness among the state agencies, that of the security forces and judiciary. Also with the constitutional bodies like National Human Rights Commission. But yet there requires a thorough investigation into the cases of media rights violation, especially that of the killings and the persons or journalists missing since the beginning of the conflict that took place for 10 years. There were altogether 35 journalists killed, of which only 2 cases went to the court, where the perpetrators are booked at this period. Also, 4 journalists are missing. And there is no concrete information, detailed information about the journalists killed or journalists missing. So the UN plan of action envisages to establish a national mechanism which the stakeholders in Nepal lobbied with the state agencies. Another tangible result is that there is a group called Nepal International Media Partnership. There are different 13 international organizations that is activated, and time and again the international community visited Nepal, pushing agenda forward. But it's still, this issue has not been discussed with the government as such, with the concerned ministry, and the parliamentarians in particular. So National Human Rights Commission as such puts this agenda of establishing a national mechanism into its 5 years long strategy. But there is no one as such to take responsibility of establishing a mechanism that could push state agencies who are responsible for not addressing the issue of impunity in some part of the nation.
Professional experience as a journalist, how Parliament could support some efforts to combat the impunity, but also the safety of journalists.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and I would like to welcome all of you to Indonesia. Indonesia has a long journey in the effort of, in its effort to have freedom of journalists or freedom of press here. We had not a good memory from 1967 to 1998, which was the Orde Baru, it's called, during the Suharto presidency, in which press was very strictly regulated. Even for the business license, the government can take it anytime they want. And journalist safety became very vulnerable during that time. In 1993, 1997, as my colleagues and other speakers have mentioned before, it was common for a journalist who went missing, hit by a police, and many other instances that were very sad. But after the Reformation era in 1998, everything started to change. We amended the Constitution, in which we make sure that the freedom of expression and freedom of information is actually part of human rights. And also we changed the press law, so now the press is monitored and run by the Press Council, no longer the government. The government has no means to do a censorship and monitoring to the press. And in terms of what you said, there was just a little bit of background on Indonesia's development on freedom of expression and freedom of press. But on point 5.22 in the UN Plan of Action, which urged stakeholders, in particular the media industry and its professional associations, to establish general safety provision for journalists. Now, on this one, we don't really have a good, a good news yet to share here, because perhaps the euphoria when we had a freedom of press in 1998 makes all the media concentrate on being free and forgetting about how to protect their journalists. I agree with my colleague from Philippines, and I think somebody also said before, one of the speakers said that the media owners have a very important role here. From my experience, it was in 2005 that I was sent to Iraq, and this is nothing to do with the unwillingness of the company that sent me. It was rather their lack of understanding, their lack of knowledge that every journalist should be protected, and it's part of their job to do that. So I was sent with a very limited preparation, limited equipment, with no guards, no bulletproof jackets. We went to Iraq under very, I cannot speak Arabic, So it was no surprise that I was abducted and taken hostage for 7 days, but luckily I came out alive. And after that, we start here in Indonesia the trend to give trainings, to give education to the journalists about the safety of journalism. I mean, Iraq is a conflict area, so it is very easy to say that it's a dangerous place. But some other places, some other coverage may not seem hostile, but it's also very dangerous. For example, in Indonesia, we have reporters writing about flood, and they became one of the victims. And one reporter died reporting on the ship that was on fire. And sometimes journalists forgot that they are also can be a victim, so they just joined. And when officers told them not to go, not to enter, they'll say because of their job as a journalist, they can enter anywhere. So again, we lost some lives there. I think, although I said earlier that Indonesia has improved a lot, but there's also issue here as well now. For example, just recently we have reporters in North Sumatra that were doing a reportage on the land dispute between the military and the people, and they were beaten and harassed. And like the other speakers told, mostly, especially this case, I can be sure because I was there accompanying them. They cannot be, it didn't go anywhere. It's unsolved. So we still face that. So I think that's why it's very important for us to work hand in hand. International support, international urge is very important to help the state member to be able to comply with the law. The law is there, but it's very difficult to comply with the points inside. I think that's it for me.
Thank you. I'm sure that after the last interventions, we will come back to this question of media industry, the responsibility of the media industry and the responsibility of the governments. Ms. Nija Bayoubi, you are working in Afghanistan. You are a journalist, you are an activist, you are heading the Kilid Group, which is a non-profit media network which published 2 of the most popular magazines in the country, plus 11 radio and cultural magazine. I think it would be important if you could mention the role of women journalists, because it's one of the aspects which is becoming very important at the international level also. What are the key challenges, what are the key issues, and are there any measures that the government has taken concerning the civil society and especially women?
Good afternoon, everyone. This is 40 years that war is in my country. And this war made Afghanistan a country that every minute news come up from my country. And it's why, because of geopolitics of Afghanistan, we have this war. Actually, this war is not ours. Others came in our land and they made us the victims of their war. A lot of countries that they have agenda in my country, they are doing their competition in my country. Many, I don't want to name them, but all of them are doing their war in my country, and that is why it made the situation dangerous for all people of Afghanistan, especially for journalists. A journalist have to report what happened in country. Sometimes government or especially government have expectation from us to report good news. But how you can report good news if there is a lot of bad news? a lot of people are losing their life, and they ask us, or they expecting us to broadcast good news. It is not possible at all. A reporter or report everything that they see and what happened. During the last 16 years, 57 journalists lost their life. They are foreigners and also Afghan journalists. I name some of them here. We lost Ajmal Naqshbandi, Samad Rouhani, Jawed Yazami, Sultan Munadi, Hashim Zada, Zakiya Zaki, Ms. Sanga Amaj, Ms. Shaima Rizai. It is just some names that I give you as an example. Everyone knows the safety have a lot of meaning in a country which is in the war. Because the journalists that they are working in the war country, they know what is safety. Because they are accepting every minute a risk. They are going to the war and making reports. They are not safe in the city. They are not safe in their office. And last 3 or 4 years, for Afghan journalists, become more dangerous because they are working in some provinces that during 1 year, it become 3 times or 4 times hand-to-hand to Taliban and back to government, to Taliban and back to government. I'm talking about Kunduz province, like example. When Taliban take Kunduz province in first time, they were looking house to house and look for journalists. They had a list with themselves, and they asked in every street, in every house, they were looking for journalists, for Afghan journalists, especially for women journalists. But a lot of them were out of the city, or they were in the villages or somewhere else. They didn't succeed to took some of them. As I told before, last 4 years become very dangerous years for Afghan journalists because there is a lot of threats. Who make these threats? Corruption is the biggest and the greatest problem of Afghanistan in this moment, because the corruption is in every layer of the government. When a journalist report or investigate about some corruption cases, it makes a big problem for them, even during the production of the report, not at the end. When the corrupt people are made some very good relation, they are like a chain. When you contact one of them, all of them will inform, and after they make a problem in front of the reporters. And this problem in the provinces is most than the capital. Drug traffickers are another problem. They make problem for Afghan journalists. Land mafia, Taliban, ISIS. ISIS and Taliban ask all the media to broadcast everything that they are giving us. When we check with government to have report balance, they are angry and they are attacking on our media. Like example, in August 2015, they attacked by 2 bombs one of our radio stations in east of Afghanistan. Everyone knows journalism is a risky job everywhere, but especially in a country like my country, like Afghanistan, it becomes the big problem for everyone, especially for women. Among 10,000 journalists who are working in Afghanistan, 2,000 of them are women. And day by day, they are going to decrease the number of women that they are active in media. Why? Because of many reasons. Security is the biggest one, because the member of the family don't want a woman journalist because of the risk that this work have. They don't allow their woman to go and work as a journalist. A lot of these women are living in the capital in 5 big cities and some other cities. But 14 provinces of Afghanistan have no even one woman journalist because there are not safety and not good situation or ready situation for this woman. With all these things, we are trying to find ways how to protect ourselves because there is no protection from government side at all. When a journalist produces a report, even from war or investigation report about corruption or anything, they have to accept the things which happen afterward because there is no protection at all. We find some ways to protect ourselves. Like example, our group in 2012, we established a kind of consortium, which we involved other media with our work. And now in a consortium, we have 62 radio stations, 1 TV, 1 news agency, and also a very famous newspaper of Afghanistan. All together come when one of us produce a sensitive report, we all together broadcast or publish this news in same day because it will protect ourselves. They can't kill all of us. But if one media do this, they will make problem to us, which we have a lot of examples, and because of lack of the time, I don't want to mention it here. But still, during this 16 years, we did a lot. We reached from no voice to more than 2,000 voice. Means during Taliban, we had no one free media, but now we have more than 2,000 registered media in Afghanistan. 260 radio, 150 TV channel, and a number of print media. This is a very good success for Afghanistan. I think now the media of Afghanistan become very strong and no one can quiet them. But still, I think Afghan journalists and Afghan media need more unity between themselves in the national level and also in the international level. And my expectation from my colleague in the world is that when something happens in Afghanistan, please cover that. Sometime I think when another country, 100 cat or 100 bird die in one day or killed by someone in one day, it become a large news. But in my country, every day, we are losing 150, 160, 200, 450 people in one day. Even in one hospital, when the attack happened, we lost 400 people in few minutes. And another attack in Mazar, 10 Talib entered in an army base, and during half an hour, they killed 450 people. It is not a joke. But I didn't hear the very large coverage from world media about that. And it is a question for me always, why it is like that. Is the blood of Afghans like others, or there is a difference? And this is my expectation as your colleague for all my friends around the world, to please cover the things which happen in Afghanistan, because it will be a pressure on the people that they are supporting the terrorism in my country, because I think this time of the world has become very different than 10 years, 20 years before. The problem which is now in Afghanistan or Iraq or somewhere else of the world, it not remain there. It will cover all the world. And please do something which you can do to stop this tourism and in the world, everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Before giving the final word to you, Jonathan, maybe I should open the floor to stay on Asia. And after you could give your experience in Colombia and the Colombian mechanism on safety. Are there any questions in the room? Yes. Can you introduce yourself and ask a very concrete question and concise question?
Thank you. My name is Azar Hasrat. I'm from Azerbaijan, not from Southeast Asia, but of course it's interesting to hear all speeches, especially the Afghan one, because we are close to Afghan people culturally, historically, and I understand what happens there. So indeed, last days, what I see in TV channels, she raised an issue in regard to covering Afghan tragedy or tragedies every day happening in Afghanistan. She's right, because several days ago in Kyrgyzstan there was a landslide, 24 people has died. Just the Western media covered it once and forgot. But in United States, 14 people were killed due to strong weather conditions, and I saw it was just circulated every 2 hours, 14 people. So this comes, do you know why this happens? Because some leading mainstream Western media channels just act based on double standards.
Okay, what is your question?
Yeah, I'm coming. So that's why while you are calling on the world media to cover Afghanistan issues or just killing of people in Afghanistan, do you believe that they will listen to you and cover more and more Afghan issues? Thank you.
Maybe I will take two more questions. You have a question. Can you introduce yourself? You don't have any question. Okay. There was Barbara, you had a question? Yes.
Yes, I actually wanted to ask, because from the presentation it seems that the situation is actually getting quite worse in terms of safety. So do you think as UNESCO that the action plan is really working? Seems to be, if indicators of the number of killed journalists is one of the measurements, it seems to be quite a failure. Would you agree?
Okay. Maybe Frank, you want to reply, and after we will ask to the second question. Yes.
You don't want to take the third one?
No, because after I want Colombia too.
Okay. No, very quickly. To answer to Barbara, I would say we believe the situation is getting worse, but it's not the fault of the action plan. This is it's ironic, but sometimes things are motivated by different reasons. We believe the action plan needs more improvement, and certainly because things are getting worse, we're getting challenged to have a better action plan, which is why we're doing the evaluation anyway after the 5 years, and we would hope to have even a better action plan, more coordination amongst all of us to do things better. But the situation is deteriorating for other conditions. It's deteriorating because there is, in the world, a trend. If you look at the speeches of candidates, you see that there's a rise in xenophobia and racism, in emphasizing the borders and building walls between peoples and not building bridges and building understanding. And I think this aggressive tone is creating a discriminated tone, and we have more and more conflicts. Wars that are not solved, that are protracted, like Syria, that are protracted for years and years at a tremendous level of suffering of the Syrian people. So these are the issues that I think we're going back to an international debate that is highly ideologicized, if I can say the word. And this, again, is bad for journalism, because now there's this whole question of who is journalism serving? This is why the fake news issue. We had a conference. Sylvie had asked me to mention. We had a conference recently, or a colloquium we called it, because that's what it was in UNESCO, on precisely fake news and the post-truth era and all the new inclinations, basically the new challenges of journalism. We think journalism is being challenged on one side because there is more violence, and the new phenomenons like harassment of women, well, it's not exactly new, but it's an increased phenomenon of harassment, sexual harassment of women journalists. But on the other hand, there's being challenged on the legal and political level. We find that there's more and more legislation in many countries now on the basis of combating terrorism, but it's beginning to limit freedom of expression and certainly to limit privacy. There's more and more legislation coming up in a few weeks in several countries on the possibility of intervening communication in internet services. So I think, yes, we are moving into a more dangerous era in the world in terms of communication, which means we really have to emphasize more our work.
Ms. Ayubi, do you want to answer?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think I'm thinking different than you, because my expectation from my colleague around the world is to ask the question from the responsible people. They have to ask the question that we can't ask. Like example, I'm asking, one day I went to the office of Minister of Narcotic. I went there and there was a tableau, and in that tableau there was mentioned in 2002, the graph showed that the production of narcotic was here. But in 2014, it came here. In the same time, when the foreign troops come to Afghanistan, they told that we are coming to Afghanistan to fight narcotic and fight terrorism. No? Now, there are many years in my country, but narcotic came from here, the production of narcotic came from here to here. On that time, we had a lot of space to go, like we can travel to every province. As a woman journalist, I traveled to 11 provinces of Afghanistan. By only myself, I went there with some colleagues and I established 11 radio stations in different provinces. But now, I can't travel to most of them because of the security. They came to fight corruption, fight terrorism and fight narcotic. Narcotic become here, the production, and security is not there. In the same time, the other side, the opposition, supported by someone, they are using gun. They are using daily more than 10,000, 15,000 bullets. They are needing food and everything. From where they find that? No, my expectation is that to my colleague around the world ask this question when they find some opportunity from the responsible. Thank you.
Thank you. A last question? Oh, sorry, please.
I think the question about whether the UN plan of action has failed, maybe it's too early to say, but perhaps it is fair to say that it needs more traction in some of the national communities, because maybe the problem is, for example, we know that it's been discussed with the national human rights institutions, but the problem is they don't have a dedicated program for the safety of journalists. Perhaps the problem is the story is lost in the broad framework of freedom of expression. This is press freedom and safety of journalists, a unique and nuanced path to taking action. The other problem, I think, is we might be doing great effort in looking at cases, but no clear targets for results. What exactly do we want to see happen? When we monitor cases, when we track cases of impunity of journalists, we do remember all their cases when there's a celebration, but I think the details of the effort could be more clear. Like, the police are so indifferent. There are task forces created, but they don't produce any reports, any action taken. Governments pay heed to respecting human rights, press freedom, but they don't actually do anything more beyond that. I mean, we've seen it in the Philippines, the biggest case of impunity single day, the Maguindanao massacre. 7 years almost of trial, no conviction as yet. Still on the level of presentation of evidence by the defense. About 200 accused, 100 of them still at large. I mean, the world community should be so concerned that a case like this, 52 persons killed, should actually go unnoticed. So I mean, those are, I think, where we could push the buttons maybe together as a community, and I think we know also our burden as journalists to come together more cohesively, more strongly, more clearly, not just as individual journalists, but as institutions, as industry, as media agencies, and compel media owners to take the side of safety of journalists.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to correct myself because I didn't say that the situation was getting worse because of UN plan, quite opposite. The situation is getting worse because despite the UN plan of action, there is still no political will. So even if all the journalists of the world come together and the state has no political will, it's going to be a failure, and that's what I meant. Thanks.
Again, I think, as Frank said, it's going to be discussed on 29th of June, and this session is important for the documents that we are going to prepare for the discussion that we will have. It's a consultation meeting with different stakeholders. There is also the question of prevention, which has not been addressed, but here also it's a key issue. May I give the floor to Jonathan Bock? He's from FLIP, the Center for Studies and Press Freedom in Colombia. Colombia has established a mechanism on safety quite a long time ago now. It has some success, and since then you have also created a web platform. So maybe you could inform the colleagues on what is this platform and how does it work, and can it be duplicated in other regions?
Yes, I would like to say that it is a very important exercise to look into the Colombian experience. As you mentioned, it started 15 years ago, and the fact that the government is responsible on the journalist protection, it is something to highlight. Also, it is need to see under a critical perspective and avoid to copy and paste this mechanism from one place to other. Each country should find his own conclusions and adapt it to its own context. In Colombia, it took 4 years to establish the mechanism from 1996 until the year 2000, and the civil society was a key element. They pressured very hard, and finally the government decided to start the safety program with its own budget and its own legal framework. I would like to highlight very briefly 5 good practices from the Colombian mechanism. For example, we have a tool that was designed by the Constitutional Court that says how should the risk be measured and evaluated. This is very specific matrix that can be a helpful guide for other countries. We have counterweights inside the mechanism, and they should control that the mechanism is being rightfully implemented. Also, the design of the mechanism includes the participation of the civil society. This is a very important issue. The mechanism actually protects journalists in small towns and places where the environment is really violent. No? So I would say that it is good. And finally, and most important, that the mechanism has saved life. In the last 15 years, we can see a highly decrease of the number of journalists that were being killed in Colombia. And the mechanism, of course, is in part responsible of that. On the other hand, I would like to mention the principal limits of the mechanism. At the beginning, its design not include the procuration of justice as a key element to protect them. to protect journalists. So the mechanism established how to protect, but know how to finish or eliminate the risk. And I think that this is very important. The second is that has not been effective in the prevention measures. A key issue also is that the state is the responsible for the protection, but in some cases the state agents are the same perpetrator. So, for example, in Nepal, it's very interested that the human commissioner is the one who is starting who wants to implement the mechanism as an independent institution. I think that it should be something to highlight. The protection of the journalists costs $7 million in Colombia. Every year, 120 journalists have some kind of measures, but at the same time, that's a problem, a sustainability problem, and every year we have difficulties to continue with the mechanism. And the most important is that the mechanism has military side, the way to do journalism in Colombia, because we have journalists that they have bodyguards for 10 or 12 years. So if you always have to be with your bodyguard or with some measures, so it's a very toxic for the journalist. And about the platform that we have made with the help of IMS and Open Society, it is the one that we are showing there. It's the Journalist Protection Wiki. It's from today, it's on air, and we include there 9 countries with different mechanisms, some that the civil society did started, others that the government, like in the Colombian case or the Mexican case, and also you can find or the countries or by mechanism. I think that it's a very useful tool for journalists and but also academics and other states that they want to learn about the other experiences. So I invite to you all to look into the page. It's journalistprotection.org, and we started today with this. We launched it today, so we are including more mechanism, and we want also that that the people that are interested in that can also participate in a very direct way, so they can edit or add more information.
Thank you. Very useful tool, I think, for everybody. Any question in the room? Okay. Melinda, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Melinda Quintos de Jesus from the Philippines. I am Executive Director of the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility. We probably were among the first to develop databases on the cases of killings in journalists globally. But that, and yet, we know that the culture of impunity, the poor judicial systems are the biggest, constitute really the challenge. It has to come from the part of government. And the success of Colombia is probably because the government has turned around and basically recognized its responsibilities to the people and recognized that journalism has to be free and protected. Until we get such a government, and we could have governments like that, they could be thrown out in the next election. I was wondering then if the UN, and I address myself specifically to Frank LaRue, because we sat in a discussion in Norway many years back where the idea of a special court either on a national level or, if it doesn't succeed on a national level, on a regional level, where such cases could be tried as special offenses or special crimes. The reason being, we have watched and we have tracked the Ampatuan massacre go through the regular court system in the Philippines, and where somebody powerful who kills off about 58 civilians in one can get away because the system actually allows him or the family to get away. The dynasty that was guilty of this can hire a high-flying legal lawyer and can go around the loopholes that the court system actually legally provides them. Whereas if there were perhaps special courts that specifically look at those loopholes and prevent the use and the manipulation of these loopholes, that there might be, just in the name of justice, such a formation. That discussion, I never heard the outcome of that again, and I wonder perhaps, Mr. Leroux, if you would perhaps speak a little bit more on this point.
Before giving the floor to Mr. Leroux, I have 2 questions.
Yeah, my name is Agustinus da Costa from Jakarta Reuters. Yeah, I'm very interested with one of the speakers saying that the media owner has their own responsibility for the safety of a journalist. It is a common understanding here in Indonesia among the people that Indonesian media, the owner of the media, they have their own political agenda. Some of the media owner, they have their political party, and it happened in the Jakarta election a couple of months ago. Some of the journalists were attacked by a protester because the protester thought that these journalists, they represent the political agenda. They become the mouthpiece of their owner. I want to ask to our Indonesian member of parliament what they think about this, and also maybe from the experience of other countries, what should be done in this such kind of case. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last question.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I have one question for Ms. Siri Corey from UNESCO. Yeah,
I am the moderator.
I'm sorry. Or any member from UNESCO? Okay, my name is Katie. I'm from Red Communication from Vietnam. And in Vietnam, UNESCO is known as an international organization for culture and education only. We now know that UNESCO have a role as related to press freedoms. So my question is, what is the UNESCO action plan in Vietnam for freedom of expression activity in the coming time? You get my point?
Yeah.
Thanks.
You don't need to reply. Okay. I can reply, but maybe the Assistant Director General wants to reply. So, Frank, you have the floor for the question asked by Melinda.
Yes. 2 things that are related that I'd like to mention. The experience of Colombia, and linking that, is, I think, a successful experience, because although it grew out of civil society, as Joaquin was saying, the government is responsible, but it is a multi-stakeholder initiative. Precisely, the flip is part of the special procedure. And also, journalists have been represented, and different institutions of the state, including the prosecutor's office and ministries. So I think what determined the element of success, I'm looking from outside, I'm not Colombian, but the element of success of Colombia is there was a consensus that this was a phenomenon, the killing of journalists, that had to be stopped, that was affecting everyone, including the image of the government and of the country. So everyone put an effort into stopping it, without assuming ideological positions, because obviously for many governments, what journalism reports is not necessarily what they like. But in any case, they all understood that the violence had gotten so severely strong that it was important for all. So it is the political will, the factor that I think is the determinant factor. In the case of Mexico, and I haven't evaluated lately, but the case of Mexico, the mechanism was established after we did a joint visit with Catalina Botero and myself as rapporteurs, and suggested that they have a mechanism, and we suggested the same conditions that the Colombian mechanism had. But and they actually had the same institutionality, the same possibility, they had funds, but it didn't work the same, because they weren't able to investigate. The impunity element was not able to be solved. Exactly the question that we were getting from Miranda from Philippines. So I think that it all deals with the political will of whether you have this multi-stakeholder dialogue and there is a common political will in putting an end to this phenomenon. The argument we received in Mexico, and I've received in many countries of the world, is that the prosecutors did not want to fulfill the investigation because they couldn't be sure that the acts of violence were related to the profession of journalism or to the investigation of journalism. And we say this is absurd, because you're trying to draw a conclusion without doing an investigation. So our premise was, let's begin from an opposite premise. Let's begin by believing that all acts of violence against a journalist are motivated by the fact that she or he are journalists, and let the investigation conclude whether this premise is true or not. Maybe it was common crime, maybe it was something else, but let the investigation at the end draw that conclusion, and don't do it a priori. So this, I think, is an important element. All investigations should begin and should conclude before the state or the prosecutors or the justice system tries to make any decision. And this is why we're now working with judges, and we eventually have to work with prosecutors as well. In 2 seconds, in terms of an international court, just for journalists, I think it would be very difficult, because I think there should be an international court for summary executions. The same way we have the International Criminal Court, but the International Criminal Court is only looking at global crimes against humanity, genocide, systematic torture, and only at the main political leaders. But I think we should be able to increase the jurisprudence of the jurisdiction of the court, the competence of the court, of the International Criminal Court, to be able to deal with systematic violence against journalists, for instance. But I would not make a separate court just for journalists, because this would be protested by everyone. But I think we have to do, what we have to do is to make the state justice system work, which should work for all sectors. Journalists as human rights defenders, as any other people that are in danger in the country. And we should make it work by pressuring the establishment of special mechanisms and special investigations to deal with that.
I'm sorry, because we don't have time. I have the colleagues at the back who are saying that it's finished. Very shortly, the media industry and the responsibility of the media industry. Maybe you can speak with the yeah, I know, very, very shortly, maybe 30 seconds.
In Indonesia now, people trust the media more than people trust the government or the parliament. So media is a very powerful institution in Indonesia now, which makes it very hard then to push them or force them to change and correct themselves. After the Reformation era, all rules on the media was given to the press council. So when they say, when you say, what do you call that? A media that is being, or choosing a side in a political contestancy, really it's the job of press council. One solution that came to my mind, which I offered continuously to the press council, is to have the press law changed or amended. But like when I said earlier, after the Orde Baru, or before the Reformation era, it was a very traumatic moment for all journalists. So they are very afraid if we change the press law now that it will bring them back to that situation. What we actually wanted to do is to change the law to give more power to the press council to be able to then give sanction, because the current law cannot or does not give the press council the rights to give sanction to the press. So yeah, it's a dilemma. I'm really hoping, I told the media industry here in Indonesia that we in the parliament would not change anything on the press law until you yourself come to us and say, okay, we want this change. Until then, we would not do anything. But we have to face also the reality that we indeed do have problems now. Because the spirit was so much different. When we formed this law, it was in a very, like I said, there's no freedom at all. But now there's too much freedom, and things need to be done to, not to, what do you call that, not to constrain the media freedom, but to make it healthier, to make it good for the people, so that they can produce good news, professional and ethical news. Thank you.
Yeah, it doesn't exclude that the media are also responsible for their own journalists and their safety. So it's a long discussion. You have some international efforts which have been done, notably for the freelancers. There is a coalition of different NGOs and civil society organizations. You also have in the industry itself some organizations like the European Broadcasting Union. They are trying to have focal points in different broadcasting organizations. Vietnam, you have asked a question of why UNESCO is dealing with media and communication. It's because it's part of its mandate, its constitution. The preamble is saying that we should reinforce the free flow of information through ideas and ideas through image and words. So it's really central to the UNESCO's mandate. And concerning Vietnam itself, we have a colleague who is going to Vietnam. I'm sure we are going to brief him of the UN plan, and he will be very active in the coming weeks. Thank you for all the panelists. It has been very interesting and challenging. And we have now the final session with the adoption of the declaration. Thank you. Thank you all of you.
Yeah.